And we're back, folks. So this is Radio Free Market, and I'm your host, Michael McKay, and with me is Dr. Thomas Woods, and we're talking about nullification. And we were just talking about how it's quite apparent that the majority of people in government today, particularly on the federal level, are unaware of any boundaries that they are restricted by. Tom, this is an outright contempt for the Constitution. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, certainly it is, and it's true that governments are very hard to restrain, and pieces of paper tend not to work very well in restraining them. And this is precisely why there needs to be some kind of external restraint on the federal government, that some kind of enforcement mechanism. And frankly, that's where the states come in. If the states do not function as a restraint on the federal government, then there will be no such restraint. It will continue to grow, and it will continue to defy any attempt at restraining it by voting for people or waiting for court cases. No, these things only wind up increasing its power. Only the states, and even then, only with great difficulty, have the chance to restrain it. But we have been taught to despise the idea of the states. The states are stupid and backward. They probably just want to oppress people. This sort of narrative of American history has worked very nicely for the federal government because it has served to demonize those forces that might have the best chance at keeping it bottled up.
Well, I know that I and a great many other Americans were at first quite optimistic and then profoundly disappointed when in 1994 Congress seemed quite serious about shrinking the size of government. And then over the next, decade, went drunk with the power to expand government the way they saw fit. It seems like the electoral option has failed, and this is, of course, where your book comes in, that Americans do have another option. And so tell us in general terms about this Jeffersonian concept of nullification.
Well, the idea comes about basically when Jefferson is contemplating the question, what is to be done when the federal government transgresses its constitutional boundaries. And, as you know, this is obviously not a hypothetical question. This is very, very important. It has indeed happened and was happening in Jefferson's day.
Well, in fact, it didn't take very long.
10 years.
Yeah, and then the
exactly.
Sedition Acts, which most Americans are unaware of. Could you kind of just
that's right.
touch on that?
One of the pieces of legislation Jefferson was concerned about. So in other words, this was not entirely just Jefferson in a leisurely way contemplating political philosophy. He was forced to contemplate this because of the Sedition Act that made it a crime to be excessively critical of the president or the Congress. You could be fined or imprisoned, and indeed people were. And, Jefferson's view was, I'm pretty sure you can't do that. And so he wanted to know what recourse was there in a situation like this. And what's interesting for us today, I think, is what Jefferson ruled out, what he ruled out as being effective ways of resisting. So, for example, we would be inclined to think today that, well, we should refer this to the federal courts and see what the Supreme Court says. Oh, okay, well, in Jefferson's day, the Supreme Court was dominated by the so-called Federalists who would have indeed held up this law. So a lot of good that would have done. But more importantly, Jefferson's view was that the Supreme Court is part of the problem. The problem is the federal government. The Supreme Court is a branch of the federal government. It can't be an impartial arbiter between itself and the states. So that's not going to work. And what would be more likely to happen would be that the federal courts would just rubber stamp everything, which indeed is precisely what they've done. You could elect people. You could wait a couple years, and indeed Jefferson himself was elected in 1800. But Jefferson was not saying, let's wait till 1800 to resolve this. He was saying, we got to resolve it now. A lot of liberties can be lost between now and then. And plus, who's to say? Maybe in 1800 you vote for another bozo, or maybe you vote for a guy who gives good speeches, but he gets in power and does the opposite. What would be the way to resist? And so Jefferson's argument was, and as I've indicated before, if the states don't function as restraints, nothing will. So the states have to say, look, you know this is unconstitutional, and I know it's unconstitutional, so therefore, out of respect for the Constitution, we can't allow this thing to be enforced in our state, and so we're just not going to do it, period. We're not going to do it.
Well, I really enjoyed reading your book, and I recommend this book very highly, folks. This should be a 101 book for every high school student in every civics class, because most Americans are not brought up understanding this 1798 Kentucky resolve that, Tom, you were just alluding to, and also Madison's Virginia resolve resolutions that he wrote. But more to the point, what was particularly interesting to me is that, as you quote here, all speeches rang with these resolutions in mind. This idea of nullification was quite profound. It actually was turned on Jefferson himself in his second term of Congress, second term as president, when in 1807 he declared this New England embargo prohibiting American ships from trading with England and France. Would you tell us a little bit more about that particular incident of that economic warfare against what essentially was against Americans?
Yeah, this is very significant, I think, because it goes to show how we need to understand the opposition to Virginia and Kentucky. Virginia and Kentucky in 1798 were the states that stood up and said, we're not going along with these Alien and Sedition Acts, and we believe in nullification. And Virginia and Kentucky passed, respectively, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of that year. The first of those drafted by Madison, the second by Jefferson. And at the time, a lot of the New England states said, oh, this is a crazy idea. You've got to just sit back and take the Sedition Act. And in fact, the New England states were all in favor of the Sedition Act. They said it's a wonderful addition to our country. There was a terrible infestation of untruths, and now we're going to strike them down and smash them. So the New England states were all against nullification because they were in favor of the Sedition Act. That's why they were against it. So then 10 years later, barely 10 years later, the New England states all of a sudden start talking nullification. Isn't that funny? This is the thing the historians leave out. The historians they dwell lovingly on the criticisms that New Englanders made of nullification in 1798, and then they totally neglect the fact that 10 years later, New Englanders are talking the same thing. And so I put some of the documents just to prove this in the second part of the book. It's all documents, and I've got the Connecticut legislature and governor talking about this, saying, look, not only do we think the embargo itself is unconstitutional, but the way it's being enforced is certainly unconstitutional. I mean, there's no question these are unconstitutional searches and seizures. They're just on the merest suspicion that we might be thinking of exporting something. No matter where in a country the cargo is, you can just take it, seize it. I mean, this is just ridiculous. And so the New England states said, we're not going to assist in the enforcement of this. State officials are not going to assist in the enforcement of it. You'll be punished and removed if you do. So, in other words, the northern states had recourse to these very ideas using the same language that we hear from Jefferson and Madison 10 years earlier. So this is not some kind of secret plot to restore the Southern Confederacy today. I mean, this is an idea that spans the whole country, North and South alike. In fact, more often we hear it from the North than from the South.
Well, let's summarize on that first point, that nullification basically means that it's up to the states to declare a law null and void and refuse to enforce it. And, this brings up, as you touched on earlier, our current arrangement, where the federal government is really set up to determine whether its own laws are legal and valid. You call this monopoly power on its own constitutional interpretation. And I wanted to read from the bottom of page 5 in your book. You write, so in a dispute between the states and the federal government, the resolution is to come from the federal government? So please expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's the basic bottom line here, is that, and I guess what we need to consider, and I mean, we have a break coming up, but we need to consider is that the objection to this, which would be, well, wouldn't this be chaotic, though, right? We'd have certain states doing some things, certain states doing others. And one of the people I include in the documents, Abel Upshur, a great Virginia judge, he entertained all these objections and I think answered them more effectively than I've ever seen them answered. He says, look, there is no perfect solution, but the two potential dangers are as follows. One, you have a totally unlimited federal government, or two, you have the inconvenience of some states enforcing some laws and some others. He says, well, okay, I know which one I am more afraid of, and and I think it's what we're living through. It's an unlimited federal government. But secondly, we should just remember That is what the United States was supposed to be, a group of states which some did some things, some did others. That was the whole point of the U.S., and now we think of this as something to be avoided. No, that's to be embraced. That's what the U.S. is supposed to be.
Right. It is actually that. It is, as you say, the United States are. They are not an is. And I think that was a quote. I took that from Art Carden's little piece that he just had published in Forbes.
Yeah,
And
that was very generous.
yeah, it was very good. Well, there was one other thing you touched on a couple of minutes ago about the Supreme Court, because I know I was brought up with the idea that the Supreme Court was really the final arbiter of determining whether or not laws were constitutional or not. And but you have this great quote in here that the Supreme Court may be perfectly impartial, a perfectly impartial tribunal to decide between two states, but it cannot be considered in that point of view when the contest lies between the United States and one of its members, meaning states.
Exactly, and this is why in his famous report of 1800, James Madison said, we need to have some defense mechanism for those cases in which even the judicial branch betrays the Constitution. They are not infallible, and we need to be protected against them as well.
Yeah, and this lack of infallibility is actually an important principle. I mean, we all regard Thomas Jefferson as being a great bulwark of our establishing and vocalizing our rights, but even as we saw in 1807, he himself was subject to that overreach of power. So we're going to have to take another break, folks, and so please stay with us, and we're going to come back in just a couple of minutes, and when we do, we're going to talk with Dr. Thomas Woods more about this topic of nullification. So please stay with us. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your host, Michael McKay. We'll be right back.